Okay, so you want to own a payment gateway. Sit quietly in the middle of every transaction, skim a tiny fee off each one, and let trillions of dollars in other people's commerce flow straight through your pipes into your pocket. Here's the problem. A payment gateway is not really in the business of moving money from a buyer to a seller. It is in the business of taking on other people's risk invisibly on every single swipe, and the fee you charge is really just the premium on an insurance policy nobody ever reads. Let's start with the fact that there isn't just one layer in this business. The card network, Visa or MasterCard, just owns the rails and sets the rules. It never actually touches the money. The issuing bank is the one that gave the customer their card and is on the hook if that customer never pays their bill. The acquiring bank is the one that has a relationship with the merchant and takes on the risk if that merchant turns out to be running a scam. And the gateway or payment service provider, a Stripe, a Square, a PayPal, is the software layer that sits on top of all three, translating a website checkout button into an actual authorization request. 4 different companies, 4 different risk profiles, all collecting a sliver of the same 2% swipe fee. Here's where the naive mental model starts to break down. You think the expensive part is building the checkout software. Writing code that accepts a credit card number is, relatively speaking, the easy part, something a small team can prototype in weeks. The expensive part is what you need before you're legally allowed to touch anyone's money at all. In the United States, moving customer funds requires a money transmitter license in essentially every single state separately. A process that can take years and run into the millions of dollars in legal and compliance costs before a company processes a single real transaction. On top of that sits PCI DSS, the security standard the card networks themselves enforce, which dictates exactly how card data has to be encrypted, stored, and audited, with real financial penalties for any gateway that fails a review. None of that shows up in a demo. All of it shows up in the budget. Here's the part almost nobody prices in correctly: chargebacks. When a cardholder disputes a charge, the money doesn't just quietly reverse. The merchant loses the sale, loses the product if it already shipped, and gets hit with an additional fee on top. And if that merchant's dispute rate climbs too high, the card networks themselves can flag the account and cut it off entirely. The gateway sits in the middle of every one of those disputes. And if the merchant can't cover the reversal, the loss climbs the chain to whoever agreed to underwrite that merchant in the first place. Fraud works the same way. Every gateway maintains a live risk scoring system running in the background of every transaction, because approving a fraudulent charge and getting stuck holding the loss is a far bigger threat to the business than losing a legitimate sale by being too cautious. So how does a payment gateway actually make its money once it's running? The headline fee looks tiny, something like 2.9% plus 30 cents per transaction, and it looks even tinier once you realize most of that number isn't kept by the gateway at all. The majority of it is interchange, the cut that gets paid straight through to the card network and the issuing bank. Money the gateway is just collecting and forwarding. What the gateway actually keeps is a thin residual markup on top of interchange, which only becomes a real business at enormous volume. Stripe alone processed over $1 trillion in total payment volume in a recent year. PayPal moved north of $1.5 trillion. At that scale, a fraction of a percent stops being a rounding error and becomes one of the largest financial businesses in the world, built entirely on being the invisible layer everyone else's transaction happens to pass through. Here's the part of this business that flips the naive assumption on its head. The real profit engine often isn't the transaction fee at all. It's the float, the gap in time between when a gateway receives a customer's payment and when it actually settles that money out to the merchant. For a day, sometimes several days, the gateway is legally holding somebody else's money. And at large enough scale, the interest earned on billions of dollars sitting in that gap for even 24 hours becomes a meaningful line on the income statement, separate from and sometimes larger than the processing fee itself. The transaction fee is the visible business. The float is the quiet one. There's a second layer to this that surprises people just as much. A payment gateway can do everything right on the technology and still collapse because of a partner 3 layers removed from the customer. Many modern fintech apps don't hold a banking license themselves. They route customer funds through a middleware company that in turn parks the money at a partner bank. When that middleware layer fails, the fintech apps built on top of it can lose access to customer funds, even though those apps never made a single mistake of their own, simply because the plumbing underneath them broke. Now let's talk about what happens when the risk model behind one of these companies turns out to be wrong, or worse, fabricated. Wirecard, a German payment processor that had grown into one of the largest fintech companies in Europe, almost collapsed in June of 2020 after auditors discovered that 1.9 billion euros the company claimed to hold in trust accounts simply did not exist. The company had spent years reporting fabricated transaction volume through partner businesses that turned out to be largely fictitious. And when the fraud finally surfaced, a firm once worth over $28 billion filed for insolvency within days, and its chief operating officer disappeared and remains a fugitive to this day. The lesson wasn't that payments are a bad business. It's that a payment gateway's entire value depends on everyone believing the money it claims to be holding is actually there. And the moment that belief breaks, there is no transaction fee large enough to rebuild it. So if you do decide to build or buy a payment gateway, remember the one thing that actually determines whether you succeed. It was never really about how fast you can approve a swipe. The checkout button was never the product. It was whether you correctly priced the risk sitting underneath every transaction you agreed to touch. And when that pricing turns out to be wrong, no amount of transaction volume can process its way out of the math.